The crowd stood in silence, unable to find the words. Eleanor's story had reshaped everything they thought they knew about Jonathan Mercer, the man they had come to honor. Only to realize they had never truly understood him. No one spoke of his charitable donations anymore. The extravagant fundraising galas, the glowing newspaper articles, the accolades, all of it seemed insignificant now. What remained in their minds was the image of a man who had lived quietly yet profoundly. Who had given everything for those he loved, even when no one was watching. Michael took a step forward, his gaze moving across the gathered mourners before settling on his father's grave. "My father once told me something," he said, his voice low but steady. He said that a person's true worth isn't measured by what they leave behind in wealth, but by the lives they've touched and changed. And today, I see that he was right, not just for me, but for everyone standing here. A soft breeze whispered through the cemetery, as if Jonathan himself were speaking his final words to them. Eleanor stepped beside Michael, resting a hand on his shoulder before turning back to face the crowd. "Jonathan is gone," she said, her voice no longer trembling but filled with conviction. "But what he left behind is something that can never fade. Not fame, not monuments or awards, but the people he changed." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over them before asking one final question. "And what about you?" she asked, her eyes sweeping over their faces. "How do you want to be remembered? For what you owned, or for the lives you touched?" No one answered, but Eleanor knew the question had already taken root in their hearts. A few lowered their heads, silent tears slipping down their cheeks. Others stepped forward, placing their final flowers on Jonathan Mercer's grave, not out of obligation, but out of newfound reverence for the man they had finally come to know. They left in quiet reflection, carrying with them something more than just memories. Not all of them would live as Jonathan Mercer had, but at the very least, they would try, and perhaps, that was his greatest legacy of all. Have you ever thought you truly knew someone, only to discover that their life was filled with secrets and sacrifices no one ever imagined? That afternoon, at Willow Grove Cemetery, a solemn crowd gathered around a freshly covered grave. The atmosphere was heavy with grief. The only sound was the wind whispering through the towering trees. They had all come to bid farewell to Jonathan Mercer, a man respected by the entire community. Known for his kindness and countless charitable deeds, his headstone bore the words, "A life of service and dedication." Among those mourning, an elderly woman stood out, not because of her attire or status, but because of the weight of her silence. In her hand, she clutched a single red rose, holding it as if it were a relic from the past. Her neatly kept silver hair was tucked beneath a simple hat, and her eyes never wavered from the casket as it was lowered into the ground. Most of those in attendance were friends, colleagues, and family members of Jonathan. They whispered words of sorrow, exchanging glances of shared grief. But few noticed Eleanor Hayes. She remained at the edge of the gathering, silent, like a witness to a story no one else knew. It wasn't until the minister concluded his final prayer that Eleanor finally stepped forward. The crunch of her footsteps on the gravel rang out in the deafening quiet. Every gaze turned toward her as she gently placed the rose upon the coffin. Then, she turned to face the puzzled faces surrounding her. A brief pause hung in the air before she spoke. "My name is Eleanor Hayes," she said, her voice low yet steady. "I don't know how many of you truly knew Jonathan Mercer, but I can tell you this. I knew him in a way that no one else here ever did." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some furrowed their brows. Others exchanged curious glances. Eleanor took a deep breath and continued. "Before this day is over, you will understand why I am here, and why the man you are mourning lived a life none of you ever truly knew." A hush fell over the cemetery. The only sound was the wind rustling through the leaves. But Eleanor's words had lit a spark, one that was about to ignite a truth that would change everything they thought they knew about Jonathan Mercer. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with memories as she was transported back to a time long past. "I met Jonathan Mercer more than 50 years ago," she began, her voice steady but commanding. "Not here, not in the quiet streets you all know, but in Birmingham, Alabama, a place where people like me were not welcome." A wave of skepticism rippled through the crowd. The Jonathan Mercer they knew was a successful businessman, a generous philanthropist, a pillar of the community. But Birmingham? Racial segregation? This was a part of his story they had never heard. Eleanor continued, her gaze distant, as if seeing the past unfold before her. I was young then, full of hope but also full of fear. I was part of the fight for equality, standing beside those brave enough to demand justice. We organized protests, held meetings, marched in the streets, demanding the right to be treated as human beings. And in the midst of it all, I met Jonathan. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd, their silence thick with anticipation. Back then, he wasn't a wealthy businessman. He was a young teacher, passionate and unafraid to stand for what was right. By day, he taught in a classroom. By night, he helped organize secret meetings where we planned our next moves. A murmur spread through the mourners. Some shook their heads, unable, or unwilling, to reconcile this version of Jonathan Mercer with the man they thought they knew. But he paid the price. Eleanor continued, her voice dipping lower. The school where he taught found out. They gave him a choice: walk away from the movement, or lose his job. She scanned the stunned faces before her. He chose to stand by his principles. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, but no one moved. The weight of her words held them in place, forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the man they were mourning. Jonathan Mercer lost his job. Friends turned their backs on him. They called him a traitor, a disruptor of the social order. Eleanor's eyes dropped to the grave before her. But he never regretted it. Not for a single moment. The air around them grew heavy, as if they all felt the burden of realizing they had never truly understood the man they claimed to honor. But this was only the beginning. Eleanor took another deep breath, bracing herself to reveal the next part of the story, one even more painful, more profound, and one that would forever change the way they saw Jonathan Mercer. Eleanor clasped her hands tightly against her chest, as if holding on to memories that time could never erase. A gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, but no one in the crowd moved. They waited, drawn into the story of the woman they had barely noticed just moments ago. But our story didn't end there. Eleanor continued, her voice firm and unwavering. Because after Jonathan lost everything, I saw him rise again, still fighting, not for himself, but for those who had no voice. She paused, her gaze sweeping across the faces before her, faces that were beginning to shift with realization. At the time, I had just lost my sister, Eleanor said, her voice trembling for a brief moment before regaining its strength. She was killed in an attack on a church where we held secret meetings. I thought I would never stand again, but Jonathan was the one who took my hand and pulled me out of the darkness. A few people in the crowd leaned forward, their eyes filled with emotion. He wasn't just a friend, Eleanor continued, her voice softer but no less powerful. He became my family, in a world where family wasn't always defined by blood. She let the weight of her words settle over them, allowing them to sink into the hearts of those who had gathered to mourn a man they thought they understood. We shared everything: pain, fear, hope. When I had nowhere else to go, Jonathan gave me a home. When I had no one left to trust, he was the one who stayed. Her words washed over the mourners like a tidal wave. Some lowered their heads, others discreetly wiped their eyes. But the most important thing, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if revealing a long-held secret, is that he never told anyone what he had done. Silence engulfed the cemetery. A few exchanged glances, struggling to grasp the weight of her revelation. The Jonathan Mercer you knew was a gentleman, a successful man, a philanthropist who gave generously. Eleanor continued, but the Jonathan Mercer I knew was a man who lost everything to protect the people society wanted to forget. No one spoke. A heavy stillness settled over the group, pressing down on them like the realization that they had never truly known the man they were grieving. Eleanor lowered her trembling hand to the casket, as if bidding one final farewell. He didn't just help me, she said softly, but every word rang with an undeniable truth. He helped dozens of others. But he never spoke of it. He didn't need recognition. He only needed to know that he had done the right thing. The crowd remained frozen. Not a single one of them, those who had once prided themselves on knowing Jonathan Mercer, could claim they had known this truth. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes resolute as she prepared to unveil the final revelation, one that would forever change the way they saw Jonathan Mercer. But that's not all, she said, her voice laced with mystery. There is still one more truth you do not know, a truth that will change everything you thought you knew about him. A ripple of tension spread through the mourners. Whispers filled the air. What could be more shocking than everything they had just heard? Eleanor tightened her grip on her hands, drawing in a deep breath. She was ready to reveal the final secret. Eleanor paused, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. The people who once believed they knew Jonathan Mercer now stood in stunned silence, as if questioning everything they had ever thought to be true. But I tell you this, Eleanor continued, her voice unwavering. Jonathan was not just a friend, not just a man who fought for justice. He was a man who dedicated his entire life to a secret that none of you ever knew. Frowns appeared across the crowd. Some exchanged uneasy glances. A secret? What could a man like Jonathan Mercer possibly have hidden? Something so profound that even his closest friends and family had never known. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if preparing to drop a bombshell into the stillness of the cemetery. Jonathan had a son. The air seemed to leave the space around them. A collective hush fell over the mourners. A few whispers broke the silence. Eyes darting between faces, searching for confirmation. They had known Jonathan for years, decades even, but never once had they heard of a child. A son he could never claim, not because he didn't want to, but because the world at that time would not allow it. Eleanor's voice was calm, yet the weight of her words struck like a hammer. Expressions of doubt flickered across the faces before her. His name is Michael, Eleanor continued, scanning the crowd as if daring someone to challenge her. His mother was a black woman. And back then, a white man loving a black woman wasn't just forbidden, it could have destroyed his life. The truth hit like a blow to the chest. Jonathan never dared to make this public, not because he was ashamed, but because he feared for his son's safety. He knew that society wouldn't accept this. He knew that even a whisper of the truth could leave that child ostracized, discriminated against, or worse. Some lowered their heads, while others shifted uncomfortably. They had never heard this story before, and that made them uneasy, because they had believed they knew Jonathan Mercer better than anyone. But now, it seemed they had never truly known him at all. Eleanor's gaze softened as she looked down, lost in memories. But even though he could never openly claim Michael, Jonathan never abandoned him. He sent money, wrote letters every week, and visited him whenever he could, always under the guise of being a family friend. Her voice wavered, just for a moment. I witnessed it all. I kept this secret for years. But today, I cannot let it be buried with him. A heavy silence hung in the air. The people who had once admired Jonathan Mercer now found themselves reckoning with a side of him they had never imagined. But Michael is not just a name from the past, Eleanor said firmly. He is here today. At that moment, from the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was tall, his features strong, his expression filled with emotion. The murmurs grew louder. Some gasped softly, others stared, studying the man, searching for traces of Jonathan Mercer in his face. And they found them, in the sharp lines of his jaw, in the quiet strength of his stance, in the determined glint in his eyes. Michael walked up beside Eleanor, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. His voice was low, yet filled with emotion. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Eleanor nodded, smiling at him through tears. Then, she turned back to the crowd. Jonathan Mercer was not a great man because of what he did in the public eye, she said, her voice ringing with conviction. He was great because of what he did when no one was watching. No one spoke. They only stood there, grappling with a truth they had never imagined. But Eleanor was not finished. Because there was still one last thing left to say. One final truth that would change everything they had ever believed about Jonathan Mercer. No one in the crowd spoke. Michael, the son Jonathan Mercer had never been able to claim, stood before them. A living testament to the sacrifices of a man they thought they had understood. Eleanor clasped her hands together, her gaze sweeping over the faces of those grappling with confusion, regret, and revelation. But she wasn't finished yet. "There is still one more truth you need to know," she said, her voice steady, "something even I didn't learn until Jonathan's final days." Once again, the crowd stilled, holding their breath as they awaited the next revelation. 2 months before he passed, Jonathan called me, Eleanor continued, her voice softer but heavy with meaning. His voice was weak, but his resolve had not faded. He told me he was putting everything in place for one last plan, something he had been working toward for years. The mourners listened intently, their minds trying to piece the puzzle together. Jonathan established a foundation, Eleanor said, her tone unwavering, not to honor his own name, not to build a legacy for himself, but to help children who were never given the opportunities they deserved. Gasps rippled through the crowd. This fund was created for children like Michael, she continued, turning to Jonathan's son, for the children society refuses to acknowledge, for the ones cast aside by prejudice, for the dreams that are crushed by injustice. Michael stepped forward, his stance strong, his expression resolute as he addressed the crowd. My father entrusted me with carrying out this mission, he said, his voice rich with emotion yet unwavering in strength. Though he could never claim me in the eyes of the world, he left me with the greatest gift, a chance to change lives. Just as he once dreamed of doing. A breeze whispered through the cemetery. But no one moved. The weight of the truth was too immense to process all at once. Jonathan never sought recognition, Eleanor added, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't do this for praise. He did it because he believed the world could be better. Because change doesn't come from wealth or status, it comes from the smallest, quietest acts of courage, the ones no one ever sees. A middle-aged woman wiped away tears. An elderly man bowed his head, lost in thought. They had spent years believing in one version of Jonathan Mercer, a version that now felt incomplete, even hollow. And now, Eleanor said, her voice carrying the weight of finality, his legacy isn't measured in bank accounts or news articles. It lives in the children he never met but spent his entire life fighting for. Silence settled over the cemetery, thick and heavy. No one could meet each other's eyes. Because they all knew the truth, none of them had ever truly known Jonathan Mercer. They had gathered to mourn a man they had admired, only to realize they had never seen him in his entirety. But Eleanor wasn't done, because there was still one final thing she needed to say, a truth that wouldn't just change the way they remembered Jonathan, but force them to look at their own lives in an entirely new light. Eleanor stood in silence for a moment, letting her words settle over the gathered mourners. No one looked at each other the same way anymore. The faces that once carried pride in knowing Jonathan Mercer now bore expressions of deep contemplation and regret. But I haven't told you the most important part, Eleanor continued, her voice quieter yet ringing through the stillness like a bell. One final act by Jonathan Mercer, a moment that defined his entire life. A few people shifted uneasily, bracing themselves for one last truth. 3 days before he passed, Jonathan called me to his side, Eleanor said, her gaze distant, as if seeing the memory unfold before her. He was weak, but when I entered the room, he struggled to sit up. I told him to rest, but he just smiled and said, I'm not done yet, Eleanor. She let out a soft chuckle, though her eyes glistened with tears. He handed me a letter. A final letter. The crowd held their breath. He told me, if I'm not here to say these words myself, then say them for me. Not so I can be praised, but so they understand that a person is not defined by what they have, but by what they give. Eleanor reached into her pocket, pulling out an old, worn letter. The edges were frayed, as though it had been held too many times to count. Her voice trembled as she began to read. If you're hearing these words, then I am no longer here. But that does not matter. What matters is that you understand, my life was never about what I achieved. It was about the people I loved and the sacrifices I was willing to make for them. I never spoke about my past. Not because I was ashamed, but because I never needed recognition. I only needed to know that I had done what was right. A few bowed their heads. Others blinked rapidly, fighting the emotions rising within them. Eleanor continued, but if there is one thing I wish to leave behind, it is this. Live a life of meaning. Not by chasing success or wealth, but by doing what is right, even when no one is watching. Remember, true legacy is not carved into stone. It is etched into the hearts of those you have helped. And if I have done that, then I leave this world with no regrets. Eleanor folded the letter carefully, holding it in her hands as if it were the most precious thing she had ever possessed. And that was Jonathan Mercer, she said, her voice no longer trembling but filled with strength. Not the man written about in newspapers. Not the dazzling businessman or the celebrated philanthropist. But a man who loved with his whole heart. Who sacrificed without asking for recognition. Who spent his entire life doing what was right, until the very end. A gentle breeze swept through the cemetery, rustling the leaves above them, as if Jonathan himself was there, listening. Eleanor lifted her gaze, her expression resolute. "And what about you?" she asked, her question hanging in the air. "How do you want to be remembered? For what you've gained? Or for what you've given?" No one answered. But Eleanor knew that in every heart present, the question had left a mark that would never fade.